Ever heard of a civilization that like gave us the alphabet, but like we don't even know if they really existed?
Yeah. It's a real head scratcher, isn't it? The
Right.
Phoenicians.
Yeah, these guys, they were like the ultimate seafarers. They dominated the Mediterranean, like
Yeah.
way before the Greeks even showed up.
They were all over the place. But the thing is, like, were they one big group or just a bunch of cities doing their own thing?
Yeah, that's what this deep dive is all about. We're going to look at some old school sources like Herodotus and what archaeologists have dug up.
We'll try to figure out who these Phoenicians really were.
It's like imagine trying to explain America, just from like news reports from other countries.
Right. Like someone's like, oh, New York and Los Angeles, they're basically the same, right? Just American cities.
Exactly. So we've got this historian, Josephine Quinn, right? She's saying Phoenician was just a label, something the Greeks slapped on them.
Yeah, she thinks cities like Tyre, Sidon, they all felt independent, not like one big Phoenician nation.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
But isn't there another side to this?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Carolina Lopez Ruiz, she's pushing back on that. She says, sure, they didn't have one name for themselves, but they had a shared culture. You could tell they were Phoenicians, even if they didn't say it.
Okay, so like a network. Connected, but not one giant blob.
You got it. And one thing that really set them apart, their skills at sea, nobody could touch them.
Yeah, they ruled the waves centuries before the Greeks. Imagine sailing 30 miles a day back then. And at night.
They were innovators, shipbuilding geniuses. They figured out how to waterproof with beady men and celestial navigation. They had that down pat.
I guess being stuck between the sea and Mount Lebanon kind of forced them to get good at sailing, huh?
You could say that. No room to expand east, so they looked to the water.
Speaking of which, their name, Phoenician, it probably comes from their most famous export, right? Tyrian purple dye.
Ah, yes, that vibrant and, shall we say, pungent purple extracted from Urex snails. It was a whole process.
Yeah.
Imagine those workshops, the smell.
Not exactly a pleasant aroma, I bet. But hey, they made their mark. And speaking of marks, they also gave us the alphabet.
It's a game changer. Streamlining hieroglyphs into a simple system that eventually became, well, pretty much every alphabet we use today. Greek, Latin, Hebrew, you name it.
It's mind-blowing. We're using their invention right now just by talking.
Right. It's a legacy that touches every corner of the world.
But we can't ignore the dark side of their history. I mean, the evidence of child sacrifice is pretty disturbing.
Yeah, it's tough to reconcile that with their achievements. Archaeologists have found these tophets, burial grounds full of urns with the remains of children.
Ugh, yeah. It's a stark reminder that the past wasn't always pretty. Makes you wonder what they believed to do something like that.
Well, the word Moloch, it might not be a god's name, more like a type of sacrifice. The gods linked to it were Baal Hammon, sometimes called Lord of the Furnace, and Tanit.
Lord of the Furnace. Wow,
Yeah.
that sounds pretty intense.
It suggests fire was a big deal in their beliefs. But remember, we're looking at a culture very different from our own.
Yeah, easy to judge, but we got to try to understand their perspective.
Exactly. And get this, Josephine Quinn, the historian we mentioned earlier, she has a theory. She thinks Carthage might have been founded by people fleeing other Phoenicians who were into child sacrifice.
Like an ancient version of folks looking for religious freedom.
Precisely. A fascinating twist. It means Carthage might not have been just a continuation of Phoenician culture, but maybe a reaction against some of it.
Wow, okay. That really changes things. It looks like we've only just scratched the surface of this civilization. We've got this debate about who they were, their mastery of the sea, their alphabet that changed the world, and then this unsettling practice of child sacrifice.
And there's so much more to uncover. Next time, we're heading straight into the heart of Carthage. We'll explore their culture, how they govern themselves, and what led to their eventual showdown with Rome.
Sounds like a trip.
Hmm.
Make sure you join us for the next part of our deep dive into the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. We'll uncover even more twists and turns that'll change how you see the ancient world.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time we talked about, where the Phoenicians came from, their amazing innovations, and some of those practices, well, the ones that are hard to understand today.
Yeah, and now we're going to head right to their most famous city, Carthage, and see what life was like back when it was at its peak.
Imagine a harbor packed with ships coming from all over the Mediterranean. Merchants are shouting, bargaining in all sorts of languages. The docks are overflowing with exotic goods, and you've got this smell, this mix of spices and salt air.
Wow, you're really painting a picture there. It sounds like a super lively place, full of trade and different cultures all mixed together.
It was. Carthage was known for being cosmopolitan and, of course, for its wealth. Remember the Tyrian shekels mentioned in the Bible?
I have to admit, Tyrian shekels aren't exactly something I'm familiar with.
Right. Well, there were silver coins minted in Tyre, one of the biggest Phoenician cities. They became like the standard currency used everywhere around the Mediterranean, kind of like the US dollar today. That tells you a lot about how much economic clout the Phoenicians had.
So they weren't just traders, they were running the whole financial system.
Yeah.
But, I mean, Carthage was also built on some pretty dark stuff, right? Like the child sacrifice we talked about. How do you square that with this image of a sophisticated cosmopolitan city?
It's a tough one, and a question that historians are still trying to figure out. It's easy to look at child sacrifice through our own modern lens and be horrified. But we have to remember, the Carthaginians had a completely different way of looking at the world, a different belief system. They thought these sacrifices were necessary, like to please the gods, make sure their crops grew, or even prevent some kind of disaster.
So they saw it as like a kind of insurance. Pay up to the gods, and they'll protect you and keep things running smoothly.
I mean, it's a simplified way of putting it, but yeah, it gives you a glimpse into their worldview. They understood the divine and the role of sacrifice in a way that we just don't.
And remember, even within Carthage, there might have been people who disagreed with this. We talked about Josephine Quinn's theory, how Carthage might have been founded by people who were against child sacrifice.
Right. It reminds us that these ancient societies, they weren't all just one big hive mind. They had different opinions, tensions bubbling under the surface.
So we know they had a sophisticated economy. What about their politics? Did they have a system like the Greeks or Romans?
From what we can tell, Carthage was a republic, similar to Rome, but not a democracy in the way Athens was. They had a senate, elected officials, a whole system to keep things in check.
Huh, interesting. So there are some parallels with the Roman Republic.
The similarities are definitely there, but the way they gained power was very different. The Romans were all about land power, while the Carthaginians, they built their empire on trade and their navy.
And that clash of empires is what led to the Punic Wars, right? Those epic battles that totally changed the ancient world.
Exactly. But before we get into all the fighting, let's talk about something that often gets overlooked when it comes to Carthage. Their art.
To be honest, when I think of Carthage, it's all ships and battles with Rome. I'm curious to hear about their artistic side. What kind of art did they create?
Well, a lot of it's been lost, either to time or destroyed in wars. But from what archaeologists have found, we know they had a thriving artistic scene. They were known for their craftsmanship, especially with metal, the jewelry, the ornaments, all incredibly detailed. And their pottery, with those unique patterns, was in high demand all over the Mediterranean.
So was there a distinct Carthaginian style? Any themes that kept popping up?
Often their art took bits and pieces from other cultures they encountered. You'd see Egyptian, Greek, even Etruscan elements all mixed together. One common image was the goddess Panet, usually shown with her arms raised, a symbol of protection and fertility.
Wow, so they were mixing and matching from all these different traditions. A real cultural melting pot.
And that mixing wasn't just in their art, it was everywhere in their society. If you walk down a street in Carthage, you'd hear a mix of languages, see people dressed in clothes from different cultures, all adding to this vibrant, cosmopolitan atmosphere.
Sounds like a fascinating place, full of contradictions. A center of trade and culture, but also with these rituals that, to us, are just horrific.
Exactly. That's what makes them so interesting to study. They make us question everything we thought we knew, force us to confront our own biases, and ultimately, they make us understand just how complex human history really is.
We've covered a lot. We talked about their dominance at sea, their religious beliefs, and this surprisingly diverse art scene.
But there's one big piece of the puzzle left. Their epic showdown with Rome.
Next time, we're going deep into the Punic Wars, those legendary battles that would decide the fate of Carthage and change Western civilization forever.
Join us as we break down the strategies, the key players, and the lasting impact of these epic clashes.
Welcome back to our deep dive. Last time, we explored Carthage in its heyday. The trade, the politics, the way they mixed all these different cultures.
And of course, we talked about that conflict brewing with Rome, a rivalry that would end up shaping both of their destinies.
This time, we're tackling those legendary clashes head-on, the Punic Wars. I mean, this wasn't just some little border dispute. This was a battle for the entire Mediterranean. It lasted over a century and had some of the most incredible military campaigns in history.
It's a period packed with drama, intrigue, and military innovations that we're still fascinated by today.
Before we jump into the specifics of each war, let's back up a bit. What was at the root of this clash of titans? What were the tensions that led to all this?
Well, at the heart of it, it was a competition for resources, for control of the Mediterranean. Both Rome and Carthage, they were expansionist powers. They both wanted to grow, and their ambitions were on a collision course.
So it's kind of like two empires bumping into each other, both wanting the same land and resources. A classic recipe for conflict, right?
Exactly. The Mediterranean was getting crowded and the pressure was building. By the middle of the 3rd century BC, both Rome and Carthage had a foothold on Sicily, and that island was strategically crucial.
So Sicily, it was like the prize that everyone wanted. It was the thing that really sparked the whole thing. Why was it so important?
It controlled these vital trade routes and was full of resources. Whoever held Sicily had a major edge in the Mediterranean.
So basically, the First Punic War was a fight for Sicily, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the defining moments of that war?
Well, the First Punic War, it lasted from 264 to 241 BC. It was brutal, fought mainly at sea. And the crazy thing is, the Romans didn't even have much of a navy at first. They had to learn fast if they wanted to challenge Carthage's dominance.
Going up against Carthage on their own turf, that must have been a huge challenge. How did they manage to catch up?
They were incredibly resourceful and determined. They studied captured Carthaginian ships, came up with new shipbuilding techniques, and they even invented this boarding device called the corvus.
The corvus? What was it?
Think of it as a big, pivoting bridge with a heavy spike underneath. It let the Romans latch on to enemy ships and turn sea battles into land battles.
So they basically turned their ships into floating bridges to use their land warfare skills. That's pretty ingenious.
It was. It totally changed the game. Of course, the Carthaginians, with all their experience at sea, they had brilliant commanders too. Guys like Hamilcar Barca, Hannibal's father, he inflicted some serious losses on the Romans.
Ah, Hannibal. We'll get to him soon, I promise. But first, how did the First Punic War finally end?
After more than 20 years of fighting, tons of casualties on both sides, Rome finally gained the upper hand. They forced Carthage to give up Sicily and pay a huge indemnity.
Round one to Rome. But as we know, it wasn't over yet. That first war just set the stage for an even bigger, more traumatic conflict, the Second Punic War. And that's where Hannibal takes center stage.
That's right, and Hannibal's story is one for the ages. He marched elephants across the Alps. His tactics were so audacious, they're still studied today.
Okay, so why did Hannibal launch such a daring campaign? What was he thinking?
Revenge, pure and simple. He grew up in the shadow of Carthage's defeat. He felt that bitterness deeply, and he saw an opportunity to hit the Roman Republic where it hurt.
And his plan was to invade Italy by crossing the Alps. I mean, that was considered practically impossible.
It was a bold move, no doubt. He assembled a massive army, elephants and all, and marched them through treacherous mountain passes. The Romans had no idea what was coming.
Can you imagine the shock in Rome when Hannibal's army suddenly appeared out of the Alps?
It must have been terrifying. And Hannibal didn't stop there. He handed the Romans defeat after defeat, most famously at Cannae in 216 BC.
Cannae, that's like the textbook example of brilliant military tactics. Even today, they study it in military schools. But if Hannibal was so successful, how come Carthage didn't win the Second Punic War?
He was a genius on the battlefield, no doubt, but he couldn't deliver the knockout blow. He just didn't have the resources or support to capture Rome itself.
So what changed things? How did Rome turn it around?
They played the long game, they avoided big, direct fights with Hannibal, and instead they slowly chipped away at his resources and support. Plus, they launched their own counteroffensive, led by Scipio Africanus. He took the fight to Carthage itself.
And that's why Hannibal had to go back to Africa, right, to defend his own homeland.
Yep, it all came down to Zama. In 22 BC, Scipio's forces crushed Hannibal's army. The Second Punic War was over.
A crushing defeat for Hannibal, a major victory for Rome. But the story doesn't end there, does it?
Yeah.
There was still one more war to come.
You got it. Even though they'd been defeated, the Romans were still paranoid about Carthage. They were terrified they'd come back stronger. And that fear led to the Third Punic War in 149 BC. It wasn't really a war, more like a brutal siege and destruction of Carthage.
So the Third Punic War, that was the final chapter in Carthage's story.
It was. The city was completely destroyed, its people were enslaved or scattered, and their land became part of the growing Roman Republic. The Carthaginian Empire was wiped off the map.
A tragic end for a civilization that had accomplished so much. But their legacy, it didn't disappear entirely, did it? I mean, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, they left their mark.
Absolutely. They were pioneers in maritime trade, masters of shipbuilding, and their cultural innovations, especially the alphabet, well, those had a huge impact on Western civilization.
It's a powerful reminder that even the mightiest empires can crumble, that you have to innovate and adapt to survive. And even in defeat, a civilization's impact can echo through history.
They make us question what we thought we knew about the past, appreciate how cultures interact, and see the power of human ingenuity and resilience, even in the face of incredible hardship.
We've come a long way in this deep dive. We've traveled from the shores of Phoenicia to the bustling streets of Carthage, explored their greatest moments, and witnessed their tragic downfall. It's been a journey through a civilization that shaped the ancient world in profound ways.
We hope you've enjoyed exploring this incredible chapter of history with us. Don't forget to check out the show notes for more information and links to learn even more.
And join us next time as we continue to explore the most fascinating mysteries of history. Until then, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.